come see me talk and ramble about creativity. I'm floored about that. So um, this is the biggest like platform I've ever had in terms of talking to people, and so I'm a little bit nervous. But what I'm talking about is something that's dear to my heart. So all that nervousness is going to go away when I start doing Shalaye because that's what I do best, right? So today I'm going to be talking about the purposeful creator, and what that is about you being your authentic self and being able to create from that place. But in order to do that, you have to understand what intentional creativity is, right? But before I start, I'm going to tell a story really quickly. All right. So who here is an anime fan? Here, anyone here into anime? Anyone? Okay, a few of you. Okay, I'm into anime. Anime, for those who don't know what that is a Japanese. They are Japanese cartoons, and they have like worldwide popular. They are pretty much popular across the globe. And I watch a lot of anime with my kids, specifically from Studio Ghibli, which are considered the Disney of Japan. And this movie, Ponyo, is a household staple for us. A little bit about Ponyo. Ponyo is about a little girl that lives under the sea with her sisters and her dad. She has this magic within her that has the ability to turn her into what she sees as her authentic true self, which is what we would consider a real girl, right? Um, at the same time, that same magic that is within her has the ability to not only destroy the world, but the universe as well. And so her parents are deathly afraid of that magic. And so what they do is they suppress that magic from her, right? But she had the courage to escape her family and go into over on the shore and reach out to stumble with a community that was able to embrace that magic within her, and ultimately she turned into that girl that we all that she knew that she would be, right? I tell this story because it speaks about creativity and the creativity that's within us. Sometimes that creativity can scare people, right? And rightfully so, because creativity, not only can it build, but it can also destroy, right? And that's something that once you understand the duality of creativity, it's easy for you to understand how to tap into it, right? Creativity is not something that's just nice, right? It also has a devilish side to it, right? There's a chaos to it that you have to understand, right? And chaos can be good, chaos can be evil, chaos can be whatever it wants to be. All right, so I want to share this quote from James Baldwin. He says, "The precise role of the artist, then, is to eliminate that darkness, blaze roads through the vast forest, so that we will not, in all our doing, lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more human dwelling place." As creatives, ultimately, what we're trying to do is, in this dark world, to shine a light where we can all connect, right? And creativity allows us to do that. So I was going to do this big spiel about who I am, but Matilda has already done that. So I don't need to go through all of this. These are just tidbits of what I've done, brands that I've worked with, and in honors and awards I've had. But all that stuff is boring, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. These here are my kids, Nife and Pharaoh. I have twin boys, 10 years old. Their names mean love in Yoruba, and they are my favorites of all time. When I'm around them, I'm like a little kid. We watch cartoons, we play video games, we talk about nonsense. We say Gen Alpha slang. I don't know if any of you have Gen Alpha kids, skibidi, whatever the case is. We do all those things, right? But there's something about them that allows me to keep that inner child in me, which is important to tap into your creativity. I'm also into sports, and this side of me is very petty, right? I'm very vindictive when it comes to sports, whether I'm competing in sports or I'm engaging with my teams. I'm very much into cheering for my favorite teams, but I'm also very much into cheering against my worst team. So I'm going to win a championship every year. If my team wins, I'm winning a championship. If my opponents lose, I've won a championship. So that's how I am with sports. Right. But the first time I really encountered creativity as something that it was a force was this picture. I encountered this picture in high school, which is secondary school, as a senior. And it's a picture of Helmut Newton's, that he took a picture of Yves Saint Laurent's Le Smoking Jacket. What drew me to this picture was the ambiguity of the subject. I didn't know if the person was a man or a woman, right? And it was my first time engaging with androgyny. the length or and the silhouette too was very intriguing. And then also the stark black and white photo. And it took me onto a journey to figure out who this person was. I started discovering who Helmut Newton was and really loved his work, but it was more about Yves Saint Laurent that who designed the suit that really touched me. And it was my first journey into, it was the gateway that opened me into what creativity and design looks like. Now, the thing was, even though I loved creativity, I didn't think it was something that I could participate in. I was consuming it, but I didn't think it was something that like someone like me could like use as to make as a livelihood. It wasn't until my college, senior year in college, where I went to an exhibition in Houston that for Basquiat. What was interesting about this was it was a life-changing event for me because I got to see art from a social political perspective that I had never really seen before. But at the end, I found out he was black, was a black man that listened to hip hop. That to me was weird. It was strange. It wasn't something that I was used to. And I was like, someone like him is similar to me, can engage in this and be as impactful, not just in the art world, but like beyond that. Now, Basquiat is everywhere, right? And so Basquiat, it changed my life, right? So with all that being said, now that I'm into, like in my career, I've had the pleasure of having my work featured on the cover of GQ and it had celebrities wear my stuff, but none of that compares to actually seeing people that you don't know that invest time and your money into engaging in your product and engaging into your ideas. So for me, this is the most satisfactory aspect of the work that I do. And so this here is an example. Seeing all of you here is an example. It's not everybody here that I know, but getting to see people who I have no idea who you are, but you're sitting down in the auditorium and you want to hear what I have to say in terms of creativity, for me brings joy to my heart. So, all right, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to go over, this is how we're covering everything. The first thing will be about intentional creativity, what that is. And then we'll talk about the fields of creativity. That's where the spaces that creativity lies in as humans. And then the next will be the process of creativity. What are the different processes of creativity that we as humans use to create? And then the last one will be building your creativity. After we've learned all those things, how do we all put it together to, build your creativity? And these are all things that I've learned in my journey as a creative. And when I say creative, I believe everybody is a creative, right? We have that inner child in us that we just need to tap into, and not everyone knows how to do that. All right, so in order to know what intentional creativity is, we have to understand what creativity is in itself. And creativity is basically the universal impulse to create processes or ideas, and it's based on the reason is for three reasons. It's to develop meaning, the first one. The second one is to problem solve. And then the third one is to socially connect. These are all things that we do as human beings to be able to make sense of the world and to have a meaningful life and to be as authentic as possible, right? Now, because we have that impulse, doesn't mean that everybody taps into that impulse. Not everyone does that. A lot of people, it could be social conditioning. It could just be the fear of isolation. Because like I said, creativity is a force that can scare people. Because there's a change that happens when you do or you are creative. And not everyone it decides to jump on that creativity. So intentional creativity is the willful action to actually jump into that and jump into that impulse. So that creative thing that you have in your mind or that idea, you actually put it into action. Now, in terms of the fields of creativity, these are the different spaces that we as human beings throughout the history of time, since we've been alive, how we've interacted with creativity. So the first one is the social aspect. This is how we as humans one-on-one interact with each other on a creative aspect. So it could be through art, it could be through fashion, it could be through music, it could be through sciences, whatever the case may be. But it's how we one-on-one interact with each other. The second one is the environmental. This is how we as humans interact with creativity with the earth itself, right? With our environment. So you think about like architecture or urban planning or something as simple like as agriculture, right? So, and then the third one is economic. The economic would be more of like the isms, so like socialism, capitalism, all the isms, in regards to the economic aspect of governance. Now, now that we have an idea of like how we interact with creativity, there are four processes that I've thought of in terms of like how we actually create as human species, right? And these are all like processes that we've done throughout history. I put it in a way where it's all like chronological, right? So the first one is the ether, which is basically creativity that taps into the divine. The second one is the like cultural, which is creativity that taps into civilization. And the third one is creativity, is the self, which is creativity that taps into it taps into like it's basically modernism. And then the fourth one is referential, which is postmodernism. And so I'm going to go into each one of these. Now here is, you all have a card that shows, if you took the leaflet, there's a card that you have in there that shows the life cycle of how we've, as human species, have used creativity as the process to tap into that creative core that we have, that universal creative core. So I'll start first with the ether, which is the divine. All right, like I said, the ether is creativity that taps into the divine. Think about the times that you have actually had like an idea or something just comes from your gut and for you to create. You can't explain what that is. And that is basically tapping from the divine, some sort of supernatural force, or you are looking into nature for some sort of inspiration, or you tap in from a religious standpoint, right? That's humans using that to like create, and that's the first form of process of creation that creativity that we as human beings use. If you look at prehistoric times and pre-colonial times, it was us using nature as an avatar to create gods, to tell stories. Whether there was an earthquake or a tornado, we would make stories to kind of make sense of what that meant, right? And this is a quote from Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones actually like basically summarizes what the ether is in this quote. He says, "You know that the birds did not imitate flutes. It's the reverse. And thunder didn't imitate drums. It was the reverse. And so the elements of nature, what it comes from, that's the most powerful force there is. It's like a melody. You can study orchestration, you can study harmony and theory and everything, but melodies come straight from God." Right? So Quincy, his process is from ether. He looks at it from the sense of like tapping into something that is unknown, that we can't explain, right? And so it's a this quote here basically summarizes what the ether is all about. All right, so what I'm going to be doing from all these different processes example, I'm going to be giving different examples, a foundational example of that process, and then I'll give you a contemporary example. All right, so this here is an aerial shot of West African village. It's the way that it's structured is based on fractals. Fractals are a geometric pattern that you usually find in nature, right? So it's like a circle within a circle, a square within a square, so on and so forth. It's something that no one can really explain. It's a phenomenon that no one has ever been able to explain. But one thing that they found out is that every African culture, every African civilization, doesn't matter how different they are, in some way, shape, or form, they all practice fractal, whether it's from a religious standpoint, whether it's from a sociological standpoint, whether it is from, the way that they dress or their traditions. There's fractals in certain things, from the way that we braid our hair to the way that, like this, for example, we set up our villages. So it's something that is not, and I don't think, obviously these people didn't have a drone where they can map out how they want to make their village to be like circle, but they were able to tap into that divine to be able to create that. Another way that we tap into the divine is using avatars, right? So we have these spiritual avatars that we create to help us understand the world through creativity. So we create these gods, right? So here are a few examples. We have Saraswati, who is a Hindu goddess of knowledge, right? We also have Obatala, who in Yoruba mythology is considered a god of play, right? We also have, even in the Bible, we have Bezalel, not Bezalel, who was appointed the chief of the tabernacle, right? And so throughout history, throughout religion, we have people who we use as avatars to tell stories and to create to as well. Here are some other examples. We have the Muses from Greek mythology, who are 9 of them were appointed to different arts within that the Greeks considered significant. And now today, you see how we use the Muses or a muse as a point of reference for inspiration. So someone could say, "Oh, this person is my muse, and that's where I draw my inspiration." So it's basically kind of similar to that. Even the Mayan culture, they had gods that were patron saints of the arts and sciences. So I'm going to now talk about some contemporary examples. Here is a contemporary example that I really love. This is artwork from a techno duo called Drexia. They make techno music from Detroit. It's two black guys, and they made 4 volumes of music that talks about, or they created a story about these beings from these underwater beings that were evolved from the pregnant women that were overthrown from the Middle Passage during slave ships, during the Middle Passage. And they evolved into beings that created technology that was so advanced, they started doing space travel, right? And so it's just like these little things where they just tapped into the divine to make that. Another example would be biomimicry. Biomimicry is basically using nature to solve problems. That's what we do as human beings. And this is an example for that. The Shinkansen train is a train, one of the fastest, it's actually the fastest train in Japan, or in the world actually, but it's based in Japan. And the first iteration of the Shinkansen train had a round nose. And whenever it would go into the tunnel, it would make a sonic boom, right? And that sonic boom was not only affecting the neighborhood, like the people around, but it was also harming the environment with the noise pollution, right? And so what they did, the Japanese train commission, they went back to the drawing board and they went into nature to find solutions to fix this problem. And so they discovered the kingfisher, and kingfisher, when they actually dive into the water, they don't break the water to catch their fish. And so they use that as inspiration to recreate the Shinkansen train, change the nose of the train to mimic the beak of the kingfisher, and it solved their problem. So now when it goes into the tunnel, it's safe, it doesn't make any sound, and it just cuts through the wind. Now, in terms of how I actually tap into the ether, these are examples of what I do, how I do that. I use inspirations like fractals to make some of our knits and sweaters, or to highlight some of the prints, to highlight like geographical aspects of fractals, and even prints too as well. All right, so the second one is the cultural. And basically, the cultural is creativity that taps into the civilization. If you think about the artisanal masters from the Renaissance or Adire dyers, these are people that they were creating things that were supposed to highlight the strength or the ingenuity of a civilization or of a community, right? And this is where that all started. It's basically where we also see the canon being established. And I'm going to show you a few examples of how that looks like. All right, so these are foundational examples. Adire is something we all know, we're all familiar with. Think about Adire as something that has like its ceremonial purposes. A lot of the motifs have symbolic meaning. So if you understand those meaning, the symbols, you can actually tell stories with them. You would see kings make this for their wives to send notes and whatnot. So it was, the Adire craftsman was a highly regarded person. They were considered masters, right? It's the same thing with Mozart with the Jupiter Symphony. A lot of people consider this the greatest symphony of all time. And then also the Kintsugi Bowl in the Far East, in Japan, they have a philosophy called wabi-sabi, which is embracing the imperfection, right? And Kintsugi highlights this, where they take broken pots and they put them together with dust and with glue or adhesive and gold particles. So that's why it looks like that. Now, a contemporary example would be someone like Francis Kere. Francis Kere is a Pritzker winning Princeton award-winning architect. And that's a big deal because Princeton is basically the Oscars for architecture. He's the only black person that's ever won it. And he won it because of this building, the Gando School. What he did is he created a school in his village in Burkina Faso where he worked with the artisans there using clay and all the things the materials that they were readily available for them, and listen to what they had to say so he can build something that not only meets their needs, but then was also marvelous and beautiful too as well. Some other examples would be my fashion brands like mine and Lagos Space Program, how we take something like Adire and we elevate it into different and express it in different ways for the contemporary markets. And then we also have brands like Capital in Japan that take a lot of these fabrics that are similar to Adire, like Boro, and also elevate it into different forms of clothing. All right, so the third one is the self. This one is basically creativity that taps into personal narratives. This is where we see things that are established in terms of modernism. Modernism comes into play, right? During the times of modernism, they are obsessed with finding an objective truth. What is the objective truth? What is the thing that we all can look at and use as our North Star in terms of ethics, in terms of how we want to respond and how we want to react? And it's also the time where you see things like public relations and propaganda come into play, right? And this is why I say that creativity is not something that's always like used to build. It can also be used to destroy. And this is a perfect example of that. And I think modernism, out of all of them, really uses it, like highlights how people use creativity to actually exploit and destroy. And I'll show you some examples. The first example, which these are foundational examples. The first example would be The Dictator, which is a movie by Charlie Chaplin, where he makes a satire pushing against fascism, right? A second one would be Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays is basically the father of public relations, and he also wrote a book called Propaganda. It's something that he was very, very, he didn't push, like, he basically used Jungian and Freudian philosophy, psychology to exploit people's desires for product. And he's the reason why a lot of corporations today actually are able to co-opt grassroots movements and turn them into something that you can capitalize. One of his most famous campaigns was the work that he did with cigarette companies, where he got women to smoke, and what he did was he marketed cigarettes as a form of rebellion, as a tool for feminism, right? So he tied feminism, when first wave was entering second wave feminism, he tied that into smoking as a way to kind of rebel and show that you are a feminist, right? So a lot of people think he's evil. I do think he's evil as well, so that's just me. But it's important to show someone like this because he's just as impactful as anybody else that we're going to mention. And it's just like to show you that creativity is something that you can use to build or you can use to destroy, right? Another example would be Augusta Savage, who created works with her community in Harlem and whatnot. Another example would be Jacob Lawrence. He created a series called The Great Migration that captured African Americans that were moving from the South all the way to the North during the Great Depression. His work is really seminal. I've actually seen an exhibition of his stuff and I cried. I cry a lot. So, in terms of speaking of crying a lot, this collection made me cry. This is an example of how I use the self. I created this collection during the pandemic. It's called That Time I Wanted to Be Seen By. And it was this desire to be seen by all these people that I have in here. This is basically the poem right here. It was that time I want to be seen by my siblings, my partner, my tribe, God, and myself, right? And in between those times, I was looking at different spaces like houses of worship and whatnot. And I used to live in Harlem in New York. And there's a church called the Greater Refuge Chapel in Harlem that I really, really liked. And I used that as a source of inspiration to create the collection, to inform the clothes, to inform the colors, and also to inform the prints too as well. All right, so the next one is postmodernism, the referential. This is where we're at right now. We're like at the end game, but this is where we're at. Some people think postmodernism is going to destroy the world. I don't think so, but whatever. The referential is basically creativity that taps into the deconstructive narratives, right? When I say deconstructive narratives, what does that mean? That means that in order for you to actually deconstruct something, you have to take something that already exists and question that thing, right? So most times postmodernism is actually attacking modernism, right? Remember I said modernism was about this objective truth. What postmodernism pushes back and says, what objective truth? What does that mean? So there's a lot of question that's asked and no answers given, right? And so that's where we're at right now. And it's this idea of like, instead of having an objective, it's all about subjectivity, right? And with that subjectivity, there's a diversity of ideas, there's diversity of different opinions and different lives that we all have to take into account, right? So this is a painting from Andy Warhol. He is basically the father of postmodernism. He was one of the people who started the movement called pop art. And within this painting, you can see how he takes something as mundane as Campbell's soup, and he draws it multiple times and frames it in a museum setting, giving it a different context. And it's this thing where he's trying to push and question the idea of what consumerism means to us as we move on into counterculture in the 60s. It's also something in fashion you see in fashion a lot in terms of like the referential. An example is Yves Saint Laurent. Again, Yves Saint Laurent is my hero. There are three heroes in fashion. Yves Saint Laurent is one of them. Miuccia Prada is the other one, and Helmut Lang. All three of those people, you can't say anything bad about them to me. But Yves Saint Laurent here he is Mondrian dress and inspired by Pierre Mondrian. That's a picture of Pierre Mondrian's work right there. So it's basically just kind of like referencing art that inspires him and applying it to his work. And that's what a lot of fashion designers do today. When you talk to a fashion designer, you ask them, what was your inspiration? And so I was inspired by this, or I'm inspired by that. And then they go into like what that reference is. And that's how I also design too as well most of the time. Another example would be the purple hibiscus that Ibrahim Mahama did at the Barbican. That is inspired by Christo and Jean-Claude's work. Christo and Jean-Claude, they are known for putting fabric on top of monuments like the Arc de Triomphe. I don't know if I said that right. My French is really bad. But they do a lot of these works, but it's very apolitical. Whereas Ibrahim Mahama's work is very political. Those fabrics are usually fabrics that he will take from ports, exported ports in Ghana and in Sierra Leone. And he will make these fabrics from them and basically bring them back to the places where they come from and put it on buildings such as the Barbican. The Barbican is basically a well-known building in London. And this is another example extending to the Drexciya example that I gave from the Ether. In this one, the artist Ellen Gallagher, she made these paintings that were inspired by Drexciya's work, from the comic book to the music that they made. And then she made these paintings to try to describe in an abstract way what the Drexciyans would actually look like. This is a picture of a movie from one of my friend, Abba Makama, made this movie called The Last Okoroshi. He always tells us that his frame of reference was from the Star Wars Episode 4, The New Hope, and that's the frame right there. And then in terms of the referential, there's the push of ideas, right? Like, so what is seen as normal? You think about like queer spaces and the people that contributed into, expanding the idea of what queerness is or what gender is. You look at artists like Julian Eastman or Sophie, right? They were able to expand that idea using sonic sounds and music and giving us basically pushing back on like what the genders are, and how we actually define gender. And then we also have the different waves of feminism, from the Scum Manifestos, which basically says that all men should die, right? To Bell Hooks, who says, no, all men should not die. We should all come together, right? And then we also have someone like Barbara Kruger, who uses feminism to question our relationship with consumerism. All right, so it would be very weird to talk about the referential and postmodernism without including hip hop in there. Hip hop is basically the poster child of postmodernism. Hip hop takes things, samples them, and changes and turns into something new. Right? It always questioning. It has a punk essence. Basically, postmodernism and referential is being punk. Right? It's being just pushing and questioning and not necessarily looking for an answer. It's just saying, no, I disagree with that, and I'm going to turn it to something, and I'm not going to explain to you why I disagree with it. Right. So all these four albums here, from Three Free Hide and Rising, Paul's Boutique, Introducing, and Since I Left You, are all examples of albums that are just mostly sample based. Since I Left You I think it has the record for the most samples in an album. I think it's about 900 samples. Every sound is a sample, right? Also, we're sticking with music. In regards to music, and the reason I'm using music is because I'm a fan of music, like big fan of music. In college, I had about, like, I'd say almost 1,000 albums just in my rack, and I could always tell when my brothers would take an album out, and I'll give them hell. But you use this example with David Bowie. His last album before he died was inspired by Kendrick Lamar's seminal album To Pimp a Butterfly. He said that when he was making, he was listening to it a lot, and that's why his last album has the same kind of sound like that Kendrick Lamar has. And then we also have Kanye West's Jesus, which is inspired by a noise rap band called Death Grips. Now, the way that I've used the referential is one of my collections called Jollof. In this collection, what I did is I took the idea of jollof rice and deconstructed it in the sense of, like, from the texture, which we dyed this fabric, a chenille fabric, to kind of give that texture, to the color too as well. But then also looking at the significance of what jollof is for us as West Africans. It's like an icebreaker of sorts, and it's something that allows us to connect with each other. And in even some communities, they use it as like a community, like something that brings them up like a community. You know, like for example, the Senegalese, when they are eating their jollof together, they eat it together in one plate, right? And so I wanted to make sure that the clothes that we were making were also cozy and had that same kind of community feel. So it's a lot of like blue collar jackets and very cozy wear too as well. All right, so I've talked about the processes of creativity. Those are all the processes that we've gone through. Now, let's talk about building your creativity. How do we build our creativity, right? There are four ways that you can do this, and this is something that I do myself. This is me giving you advice on how to be creative, right? The first one is knowledge as power. The second one is basically developing forms of play. The third one is world building. And then the fourth one is mapping it out. So I'm going to break all these down. All right, so knowledge as power is basically taking up as much information as possible. Like it could be art, it could be science, it could be whatever the case is. You just soaking, being a sponge where you are able to take and soak in as much things as possible. The reason being is because you want to build a library in your head of things that you can always reference. Because as you are creating, you don't want to always start from scratch. I don't have to start from scratch because I have a Rolodex of things that I always use as a reference, right? And so I always encourage people, when they always ask me, the first thing they ask is like, how do I be creative? I'm like, just go and learn. Learn everything, right? Learn art, learn music. And when I say learn everything, I mean the music itself. Don't say that you're going to listen to music and you only listen to Afro beats. You have to listen to the weirdest things out there because you need to understand what are the limits of stretching. So for example, my brother, he used to be a producer, right? And he used to always get annoyed when I would send him music to listen to. And I'm saying, just listen to this thing as a reference. And he would always think that I was trying to make him an avant-garde producer. And I'm like, no, I'm not sending you John Cage 433 for no reason. And I can understand why that's an annoying thing, because for all of you that don't know John Cage 433, it's basically music that is silent for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Right? So, someone sending that to you, I can understand why they think I'm taking a piss. But it was for me, I was sharing that with him so he understands the things that people do to stretch the limits of creativity. Right? So it's not that, okay, now you have to do that. It's just like, oh, these are what people are doing. Right? So you put that in your head as a mental thing. Right? And then you may never know, later down the line, you can come back and then you can use it. right? I remember I also sent him a song by King Crimson called 21st Century Schizoid Man. He laughed at it, and then Kanye used it for Power. And then he was like, "Nee, you sent that to me." And so it's just the idea of like, look, it's not really about like copying these people. It's just knowing what is out there, right? And the more information that you gather, the better you are equipped to be creative, right? You have to develop hobbies, and these hobbies don't have to be things that are ambitious. It's just things that you just do to kick it. Some of the hobbies that I do now is with my kids, right? I watch all kinds of stupid shows with them. I play all kinds of silly games with them. And they keep that inner child in me for me to be able to, like, when I'm playing, ideas start popping up and I can write things down and scribble, right? So it's very important for you to develop hobbies. I know us as adults, we're all busy, right? We all have things that we have to do, and we all have these ambitions that we want to complete. But you have to have time to sit down, whether it's playing video games, whether it's working out, whether it's some sort of routine. But you have to develop a space of a hobby that you need to do and acquire that, right? And become like fully engulfed in it, taking deep dives into these things, right? But I will say this: doing that, there could be some isolation that happens, right? And when that happens, make sure that you get yourself in a community of people that are like-minded, but they also know more than you do, right? So you're constantly asking questions, right? And you're engaging with them too as well. All right, so I'll give some examples of people who actually do this well. Jun Takahashi is a designer at Undercover. He's based in Japan. He's one of the most renowned fashion designers in the world, and he's a nerd through and through. If you talk to him, he talks about all the different music that he listens to, all the vinyl he collects, and all the artworks he's into. And because of that, he's so versatile. He can do something as couture as this right here, but he can also do something so streetwear that is referencing anime. Not many people can do that. That's talent that he's acquired from the knowledge that he gains as power, right? We're going to talk about Kanye West. Kanye West is a perfect example of this. Kanye West is basically a polymath that can work with someone like George Kondo to make his album artwork, because that's what he can do, because he's Kanye. But then he can also do a fashion show at the Communist Center in Paris that was built by Oscar Niemeyer, right? And then he's always constantly hanging with people who know more than him, right? Kanye, I always say he's a gateway to the masses, right? And he's always the one that can build things, bring things from, because he hangs with people on the fringe, and he brings them in and he opens the gateway for them, right? The example that I use with Yeezus and Death Grips, I remember the first time I heard Yeezus, it was so weird to me because I was like, this sounds like Death Grips, right? But a lot of people wouldn't listen to Death Grips, but they would listen to Yeezus because Kanye has taken something that's from the fringe and distilled it in a way that people from the mainstream can understand it, right? I tried as much as possible. The nerd in me would say, oh, if you like Yeezus, you should listen to Death Grips. And they would listen to Death Grips and I'd be like, nee, don't do that again. Just no, don't give me Death Grips again. All right, so this is an example of how I use knowledge as power. Here is a screenshot of my Google Drive. It's just a bunch of images and things that I store. I also have I'm always storing links of podcasts and links of videos that I can listen to, articles that I can read. It's just basically surrounding myself with things that I can always fall into. So when it's time for me to design and they say, oh, Nee, you need to do this in 5 minutes or 10 days, I'm not stressed because I know I can just tap into that Rolodex that I have already built. Now, how do I build that Rolodex? It's a lot of browsing, right? Before the internet, it was in school, libraries and whatnot. This is how my laptop looks like. I have 3 browsers up if you don't see them. And each browser has about 100 tabs. This is the chaos that I'm talking about when it comes to creativity. It has to be messy, or else it's just you're not being creative. Right? The process is very, very messy. All right, so the next one is developing your form of play. This is where you unlock the child in you. All of us have a child in us. All of us, right? We either neglect that child or we feed that child. There's nothing it's either one of those things, right? And in order to tap into that creativity, you have to tap into that childlike wonder, right? Because when you're a child, think of children when they're playing, they're okay being silly. They're okay. They don't see like they don't have an issue of like being embarrassed. They're like okay with like jumping into things, right? And so, but us as adults, we've been conditioned to see those things as something that's shameful. So there's a lot of shame that comes with designing. I mean, with play, right? But what the way that I would say you can approach it is looking at the world as your whole like your sorry, like your playground, right? And it's this big sandbox, right? And you are building sandcastles with a bunch of people, right? That's how you should look at it. But one the things that you can do in terms of the childlike wonder is doing those kind of like exercises, but then also yeah, creating having like creative exercises that you can do, and then also just like join have people join you in that community, right? Again, think of the world as a playground, and then you have no issues finding people. I always find people that share the same interests, and before we know it, we're friends. We're talking about nonsense for hours. I mean, some of my good friends that I meet that are creatives over here, I met them on Facebook. We created a Facebook group called Alternative Africans, and what we used to talk about nonsense, right? But because we were able to tap into that childlike wonder within us, we've all stayed really cool, and we're all in creative fields. Yeah, you also have to embrace the chaos. This looks like chaos right here. This is an example of my scrapbook. Well, I'm just constantly drawing things, designing things, just allowing things to play out, whether I'm tapping into the ether or looking at some reference. It's just constant drawing, constant scribbling. This is another exercise that I do a lot. They don't call me Shalaya King for no reason. I'm constantly using words and putting words together to describe projects and ideas that I have in my head. So if for Post Imperial, for example, there are words that I've constantly used as a reference for Post Imperial, and I always like update those words. And the reason why I do that is so that it allows me to, if someone were to ask me what Post Imperial is about, like I can like tell them in 30 seconds because those words I've developed them for years. Right. And so this is an exercise that I always encourage people to do. Just write down words of things that apply to your aesthetic or your creativity or the things that you want to do. And you before you know it, you start developing something from there. All right. This is my favorite part of building creativity, world building. Why? It's because there's a lot of storytelling that happens in that. And I love to talk. All right. It's basically just looking at every opportunity to tell a story. You have these ideas, you don't feel afraid to like revisit them. You just keep like going to them over and over and over again. And I'll show you an example of how that works, right? But you just embrace your creative endeavors and you just expand on that. This is an example of world building. During the pandemic, I was not able to see a lot of the buyers that we usually see in person. So what I did is instead of doing a regular line sheet, I created a line book that became kind of like a magazine, a digital magazine. In that line book, it would have the information on the collection, the inspiration, the sources of the information, the references, details of the products. So it felt like a magazine, and the my buyers felt very like it was a refreshing take from all the different like Excel sheets that they were going through, right? But it was also still practical. They could like enjoy reading it, but then still order from the catalog as well, right? And so ever since then, I've used this as my reference as a line book, and they're always looking forward to like the line book. They're like, "Nee, I've seen it close now, but please send me the line book because I want to like really sit down and like balance and read what was going through your mind when you were creating this." Another thing was in terms of like the world building is being intentional with like little things in terms of like brand identifiers. So for example, we have these package stickers that we made for packaging that's supposed to resemble travel. And then we also have a font that we developed that is specific for all our assets, including when we send emails. It's that serious. Now, in terms of building on old ideas or building on ideas, this is an example of that. This right here was the first one you're looking at on my right was the first. It was a baseball jersey that we made that we were trying to get away from like making shirts, and so we made the baseball jersey, and then it evolved into a short tunic, a cropped tunic that we basically evolved it into a crop tunic, and then after that we now evolved it into a boo, and that boo has now become our best-selling product. Even though we sell shirts, this is, I mean, white people to buy this stuff too now as well. So all right, and so some other examples would be the quilting that we have in here. You might not necessarily be able to see it, but the quilting is supposed to mimic fractals. And then we also have these local loops that you see by the label. Those local loops were created from scrap fabrics from previous collections, and each one of our clothing has them in there. Even though it's practical, it's something that you can see and signify and say, oh, okay, that's from post-imperial. All right, so the last one is mapping it out. Now, I know I said world building is my favorite one, but I like this one too as well. Map making is basically like where you create a map of your ideas. It's kind of like using it as a North Star, right? And I love doing is just sitting down and writing things down and trying to connect stuff together to create a map. And like before I know it, I'm seeing the vision and what I want to do. Right. And there are three P's to put this to do this. Right. The first one is basically your purpose. Right. What is basically the goal that you want to achieve? The second one is is your principle. The third one is your platform. Right. And with these three P's, I was able to create this. This is the map that we use for post-imperial. It's called empathic design. We use this map to generate our ideas from a conceptual standpoint to a creative standpoint, and even to make money, right? And the way that we do that is using collaboration as the heart of the matter. And we collaborate with three ways. We collaborate with people, with myth making. So that is all our artisans, all the shippers that ship our stuff, the people who make our clothes, everybody that is part of making the clothes is part of the myth making. The second one is humanizing materials. This is where we collaborate with materials. And when I say collaborate, I mean like really collaborate. We look at materials the same way we look at human beings. Kind of similar to animism, where every object has a soul, right? So when you do that, it's very difficult for you to get like discard materials. So the zippers, we talk to our zippers and say, how can we give you your highest value? We talk to our buttons, how can we give you highest value? We talk to our materials, how can we give you the highest value, right? And so when we do that, right, we take care of those the materials, and we're able to make like products of the highest quality. I mean, we're making our stuff in Lagos, and it's when it goes to stores that carry Gucci and the rest of the other high fashion brands, and no one ever complains about the quality of our products. And that's because we've ingrained that into our culture of like humanizing the materials, right? The third one is connecting to the diaspora. And this is where we as becoming as cultural translators for the global village, right? This is where, we look at Adire and then we honor that tradition and respect it and work with them in collaboration to elevate it into another way and deconstruct it so that people from other cultures can understand it, right? And do it in a way where we are expressing it to different cultures. So for example, in Japan, they look at Adire from a craft standpoint. That's what they appreciate. But in the West, they appreciate it from a social standpoint, right? The people who are making it and the historical aspect of it. So it's us highlighting those things and knowing who we're talking to and making sure that they understand the traditions and the textiles that we're using and respecting them. So all these things put together, right, create these different cultural futures that we want to do at Post Imperial. And so it informs us on how we want to design. It informs us on how we want to sell our clothes. It informs us on how we want to basically move around the world. And it makes us as authentic as possible. Now, back to the story I told you about Ponyo. We talked about Ponyo and how she was able to eventually become a real girl, right? And she was able to do that because she found her community, right? And the community encouraged her they embraced who she was, they embraced her quirks, and she became her authentic self. You can't be creative if you're not being your authentic self. I mean, you can, but then you just end up like Edward Bernays, and we don't want that, right? So I'll give you a story of how I embraced my authentic self, and it's one of the ways and when I did, I was able to be a better designer. So remember I talked about my two boys, Nife and Ferron. So Ferron, right, I consider him the moral compass of our family, right? So one time he heard me talking to his teacher. We were in America, and I was using my American accent. He was 4 years old at the time. He pulls me to the side and he says, "Daddy, I'm very, very disappointed in you." And I'm like, "Why? What did I do? I don't understand. Why are you so disappointed?" He said, "When you talk to me, you talk like this." And he did my Nigerian accent. He said, "But when you talk to my teacher, you talk like this and use an American accent." I said, "What's wrong with that?" He said, "You're not being your true self." And, I tried to laugh it off. And then he was like, "Daddy, I'm serious. You are not being your true self." And then he went back to eating his donuts. But he didn't realize he gave me an existential crisis for 2 weeks, right? And with that existential crisis, I started asking myself, like, what, no, really, why do I use an American accent? Why do I code switch? A lot of us that are overseas, we understand that idea of code switching, where we have to change like how we speak to address different people. The excuses I was telling myself was for people to understand me so that I don't have to. But I live in New York, where there are 1,000 accents and nobody's changing their accents and everybody understands what they're saying, right? When I came to Houston when I was 14, I developed that accent out of survival. So it made sense when I was using it then, right? But I didn't need it anymore. And he knew that, right? Because he could see how much I changed when I changed that accent. There's a persona that a mask that I put on, right? And this now I know be for everybody. Not everybody like goes through this. But this was what I went through, right? But once I shed that accent and I just decided I'm going to use my Nigerian accent, it felt like there was a burden that was lifted off me and I just became my true self, right? And I was afraid because I thought there would be some shame that was involved with it, but it was the most anticlimactic thing ever. Nobody cared. Nobody cared, right? So a lot of times we have these things in our head when we're thinking about what people are going to think about us, and then we try to shape ourselves for those people, and they don't really care. Everyone is in their own world, right? So I encourage all of you, right, to do what Ponyo was doing, right? As this moment was when she transformed to that girl and she was running on the waves, right? This was her being her true, authentic self. So everybody here, with all the things that I've given you, all the processes, I encourage you all to do the same thing that Ponyo is doing. You should run like Ponyo. So that's what I'd say.